Okie dokie. So, welcome back to the Sugar-Free Show. It has been 6 years since my last Sugar-Free Show interview, and I couldn't think of a more incredible person to kick the series off again. Our guest today is a true pioneer in the field of nutrition and addiction research. Dr. Nicole Avena is an assistant professor of neuroscience at Mount Sinai School of Medicine and a visiting professor of health psychology at Princeton University. She's dedicated her career to understanding how foods, especially those high in sugar and fat, can trigger addictive behaviors in the brain. Dr. Avena received her PhD in neuroscience and psychology from Princeton, followed by a postdoctoral fellowship in molecular biology. Her groundbreaking research has shed light on the biochemical ways sugar taps into the brain's reward pathways in a manner strikingly similar to drugs like nicotine and opioids. She's published so many scholarly articles, and her work has been featured extensively in media, including the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and Good Morning America. Her 2023 book, Sugarless, which is incredible, has drawn wide acclaim for breaking down the complex neuroscience behind sugar addiction in an accessible way while providing actionable steps to cut sugar cravings. Dr. Avena is on a mission to raise awareness of sugar's addictive potential and help people break free. I am so thrilled to have her on the Sugar-Free Show to share her invaluable insights. Welcome, Dr. Avena. I'm so happy to have you.
Oh, thank you. I'm so happy to be here. And I didn't realize I was your first guest since you have revisited this. So
Yeah.
I'm so grateful. I'm extra grateful now.
Yeah, totally. I was like, I saw your book came out. Rob Lustig sent me a message saying, "Hey, I'm doing a talk with Nicole Avena
Mhm.
in San Francisco. Come join us." And I was like, "Oh, I wish, but I had my son's football tournament or something." But anyway, I ordered your book and I read it, and I was like, "Oh, I felt like I had come home." So massive congrats on
Oh,
such
thank
an
you.
incredible, like a piece of work. What can you share with an audience who may not be familiar with you? What is your background and what inspired you to research and write about sugar addiction?
Well, I have a bit of a different background, I think, than a lot of people who, are in this space of educating people around sugar addiction. So I kind of stepped into this when I was in graduate school. I literally was day one in graduate school at Princeton University. I was doing a PhD in neuroscience, and I was trying to decide with my advisor what I would do for my dissertation. And a dissertation is this like massive 5-year long project, and it's got to be something kind of big and exciting. And so we were talking about different ideas. And one of the things that I had been interested in was the fact that, at this time, this is dating myself, but this is back in the year 2000, we were hearing a lot about obesity rates going up. But at the time, it was still thought of that people who were struggling with obesity, it was because it was their fault. It was because they couldn't control themselves and that, they needed to just get their act together and eat less. And that was the messaging. And, I kind of didn't really resonate well with that. To me, it seemed a little not right because at the same time, there was all this public health information out there telling people like, yes, it can be dangerous if you're obese, you got to eat healthy, but people seem to have a really hard time doing that. And so we started toying with this idea of, well, maybe it's not the people, maybe it's the food. Maybe there's something about our modern food environment that's causing people to overeat, like people who are addicted to things like drugs and alcohol. And so at the time, it was kind of this wacky idea because nobody was talking about food and sugar in particular as being an addictive substance. People thought things that were addictive were drugs and alcohol. And so we decided to start off by doing a bunch of experiments to test whether or not sugar could meet the criteria for being an addictive substance. And so basically, we just started chipping away study by study. We were publishing papers. And that's really how it started. That's how I got here. And now, flash forward, I can't believe it's been 20 years ago. But, we've published a lot in this space. And it's not just us. Other labs have also been publishing around this. And it's, I think, really seen its time in the sense that the science is really clear now that sugar can be an addictive substance.
I love that. So I want to know what is the definition of sugar addiction?
So we've been using the definition of addiction that the American Psychiatric Association uses to diagnose people as having substance use disorder. So if you have problems with drugs or alcohol, there are criteria for substance use disorder. And if you meet certain numbers of those criteria, then you can receive the diagnosis of having a mild substance use disorder or moderate or maybe even severe if you have a lot of those symptoms. And so basically, we've done the same thing with sugar, where we've looked at each of those criteria and applied it to sugar. And so there are things like binging, experiencing withdrawal if you try to give it up, spending an enormous amount of time thinking about the substance, using the substance, having cravings for the substance, maybe using the substance despite the fact that it's causing you physical harm, which is often the case when people are diagnosed with diabetes or cardiovascular disease and they continue to overeat things that have added sugar, even though they have these physical health links to the added sugar. So again, it's really just those same criteria that we use to diagnose someone as having an addiction to anything else. And we can see it with sugar as well.
Yeah, I love that. The compulsive pursuit of a behaviorist substance despite the negative consequences, right? Which is exactly what you laid out. Now, when do you think sugar addiction is going to be accepted or listed in the DSM as an addiction?
Yeah, it's a good question. I know there are people working toward getting some of these, agencies that are stakeholders involved with making this be something that people can actually receive a diagnosis for, because there is a lot that goes into that. And, being able to be diagnosed as having a food addiction would enable people to get reimbursement from healthcare. It would allow people to then, have a label for something that's like seriously affecting their mental health and their physical health, right? I mean, right now, people kind of have to dance around the term that they have a food addiction, and they have to kind of piecemeal together, a treatment plan because it isn't an officially recognized condition. So I know that I'm part of a group that is petitioning the ICD. We'll be getting together in May in London to
Yes.
yeah, I'll have to send you the information about this, but it's happening in May in London, and it's a group of experts that have been put together to really kind of make this consensus statement to essentially pitch this to the ICD so that we can get this potentially recognized as a condition. And I know that other groups are working on the DSM at the same time. So cross fingers, I think we're getting closer. We're not quite there yet, but I definitely think steps are being made in the direction.
It's so funny you mentioned this because I saw a tweet from Nina Teicholz yesterday, and it said, in London, researchers are working on a formal definition of food addiction, which is increasingly recognized as a serious problem. Sugar addiction is, in my opinion, at the root of it. The first food recognized as addictive was chocolate shortly after sugar entered the food supply. Attend this conference to learn more. So, I mean, like, here are these experts who, I mean, previously we're kind of like on the fence, honestly, about whether sugar really is an addiction or not, are actually coming forward and speaking up. I want to know, you have been at the forefront of this for 20 years, right? Like, you did the original studies with the rats and cocaine and sugar. You must have received so much backlash, because if I look at the backlash that I've received just as like a person who's willing to talk about this, like, I want to know, and how do you deal with this? And how do you still deal with some of these? There are a lot of these fitness influencers that are men. Okay. They have these big muscles and these big attitudes, and they are so quick to come at us and say that this is not real. It's not an addiction. How do you deal with this?
Yeah, you're right. I've gotten my fair amount of backlash over the years, but that's okay. I feel like it's made me a better researcher. It's made me a stronger woman. And I think that, when people come at you, especially in a very aggressive way, in a very emotionally charged way, usually it means you're right. And they're right. They're using their emotions to try to like kind of like have you back down. So I think that for me, it's really encouraged me to just keep moving forward. And, I've had this happen not only from just the general public, but also just academics. I mean, it's not the case that all academics agree with this. There's a lot of people out there still, and a lot of have changed. They've been convinced. So I think a lot of people have turned the corner and now would agree with me and you. But there are still some holdouts that, will say things like, oh, well, it's not food addiction, it's eating addiction, or they kind of try to come up with these like, terms or this noise that they're making to really just detract from the issue, which is, look, it's the sugar. If you look at all the processed food that's out there, if you look at the amount of sugar in our food environment, I mean, the links are very clear. It's the added sugar that's causing these health issues. Knowing that it's addictive, knowing that it's toxic, we need to start to do something about it. And so I think we're getting there. But like I said, it's one of those things that takes time, but it's worth it in the end.
Yeah, for sure. I think one of the biggest backlashes that I get is like, oh my gosh, no one's going to be addicted to just table sugar, right? Like no one's going to sit and eat table sugar out of a bag. So how can you call it sugar addiction? Isn't it the combination of salt, sugar, fat, the stuff that stimulates the bliss points? Like, how do you answer that?
Well, I mean, I look at that like, okay, yeah, there are various different things that can exacerbate an addiction, right? And I think when we look at what's the sort of bottom line commonality amongst all these foods and the tastes and things like that, sugar is part of it. Sugar is the primary driver. Yes, the bliss point can be enhanced when you add, sweetener, other sweeteners, or when you add, salt, or when you make it more savory, and you can do all these things, but that's just making it more addictive. I think that the root ingredient is the sugar. And when you take a look at the processed foods that are out there and all of these foods that people tend to have problems controlling their intake of, the common denominator is the sugar. It's the amount of sugar that they contain. So my answer to that is like, yeah, just like you can, have polysubstance abuse, you can mix drugs together when you're consuming them. That doesn't mean that the drugs aren't addictive, right? Because there certainly are. You can just enhance that addiction when you mix them all together.
Yeah, no, for sure. I want to switch gears a little bit, not completely, but to the book, cites a ton of research on how sugar impacts the brain's reward pathways. And I really, there's this big, we've been led to believe that it's willpower. It's our lack of willpower that's leading us to overeat and be overweight and just like chronic disease manifesting because of our lifestyle. Can you talk a little bit about the neuroscience and what sugar does to the brain?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I really got interested in this because of that willpower piece, right? Because that just didn't make sense to me. It can't all be about willpower. And what we found in our research is that when we take a look at the brains of our rats, and we've done other studies where we're looking at brains of humans, when sugar is consumed, it causes an activation in the reward centers in the brain. It releases dopamine in a way that's like what happens when someone uses drugs or alcohol.
Yeah.
And so that doesn't happen with food. It only happens with drugs and alcohol. And we're able to see it happening with sugar. And so when we're able to demonstrate that, that really is the hallmark of drug addiction in terms of the neurobiology. And that's why when people say that, oh, well, sugar can't be addictive because it's a food, or, oh, well, we need sugar to survive. No, we don't need sugar to survive. Our body will make the sugar that we need to survive, right? Even if you don't eat a lick of sugar, your body will make it for you. It's called gluconeogenesis, and it's one of the ways in which we can survive when we used to not have access to all of these complex carbohydrates, right? Or we didn't have access to fruits only seasonally, and we didn't have access to things that, would provide us with that added sugar. And so it's that dopamine release that happens when we consume the added sugar that is like what happens when people use drugs. And that's really what's driving this addiction from the brain standpoint.
So what's the difference between fruit and sugar? I mean, sugar and fruit, sorry, and refined sugar.
So I view fruit as the way in which nature has packaged it to be an amount of sugar. And again, it's not added sugar. This is sugar that just naturally occurs in the fruit. And it also has fiber, it has other micronutrients that is packaged in a way that is not going to impact us in the way in which we're being impacted by this plethora of products with all these added sugars, all of these engineered foods with tons of added sugars and ingredients in them. And so people will often ask me that because they'll hear, oh, well, if sugar's bad for you, should I avoid fruit? And my answer is no. I don't think that people are struggling with obesity because they're eating too many strawberries. I think that they're struggling with obesity and binge eating because of all of these processed foods. And so what I recommend is that people view fruit as something that they can use when they do have a sugar craving. So if you are craving sugar, instead of having that candy bar or that granola bar, have a couple of grapes or cut up some strawberries or have an orange. It can be a way to satisfy that sweet craving, but you're still going to have the fiber. You're going to have those other nutrients that, again, are packaged in a way that's going to mitigate the effects that the sugar is going to have on our brain.
Yeah, I mean, I love that. I completely agree as well. So, um, there's so much in your book that I want to go over, but I think to keep it as simple as possible, what are some of the most concerning health impacts of excessive sugar consumption that you highlight in the book?
Well, I mean, certainly there's the ones we always hear about, right? Like overeating, we hear about obesity, we hear a lot about diabetes. But now we're learning a lot more about the links between sugar and cardiovascular disease. And I think that that's really important because if you look back in time, right, it was fat that was blamed for cardiovascular disease. People were advised not to eat fat. If you want to have a heart healthy food, you got to eat low fat, low fat. And that was really kind of pushed on us for quite a bit of time in the 90s and the early part of the 2000s. And, when you take a look at the data, it turns out that when you take all the fat out of the food, you replace it with sugar. And that's what the food companies were doing. So, there was all these cookies and products that were available that were labeled as fat free. And so people thought that, all right, well, these are heart healthy. They're good for me. Cereals, things like that, all labeled as fat free or low fat. But guess what? If you take the fat out, it tastes terrible.
Yeah.
So the companies added a bunch of sugar. And so that contributed to us getting hooked on sugar. And that also contributed to the increased rates of cardiovascular disease that we're seeing. And again, it's not the fat. It seems like the sugar is the culprit when it comes to the cardiovascular disease situation. And there's lots of research that backs that up now. Another one that I wanted to mention was the mental health piece. And this is so important because our mood is directly reflected by what we eat. And when people stop eating sugar or all that added sugar, they experience this total change in their mood. And it's an evenness. It's, people who were sad would suddenly say like, oh, I feel fine now. I feel happier. And I think there's such an important part of that discussion that we're not having enough about how if you're struggling with your mood, changing your diet is critical because it can have such a significant impact.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it follows a lot with the work that Chris Palmer is doing and Shivani Shetty, the psychiatrists out of Harvard and Stanford, who are talking about the link between metabolic health and mental health and how, even though there's a place for medication, like unless we address the metabolic health, like our mental health is not going to change. And so I love that you are, exposing it even more. Do you, with regards to like coming off sugar, which is what we just spoke about, the detox, the withdrawals, what in the research, what have you seen? What do people have to go through, to get through that phase?
Yeah, I think that's the scary part for people, right? I think that's what holds people back because they think, oh my gosh, like, how am I going to get through this? Like, how am I going to deal with, the feelings I'll have? And, they use sugar as a way to self-medicate. A lot of people use it as an important tool in their life. And the thought of giving it up, it's like giving up your best friend. And so, what we're seeing though is that the withdrawal really varies, and it can vary depending on the individual in terms of, the length of time that they've been over consuming sugar. It also can vary really just depending on the individual in terms of what they're doing instead of eating sugar, right? And so it's usually a few days to maybe 2 weeks at most that people feel uncomfortable. They might have headaches. They might, feel a little irritable and cranky. They might, find that they're, lethargic. And again, these are the symptoms of withdrawal. And it's not all that different from coming off of tobacco. Again, some people find that, hey, it actually wasn't that bad. Like I got through it and, I'm fine. But I think a lot of people are scared because they don't know what to do about it. And one of the things that I talk about a lot in the book is, what to expect when you're in withdrawal from sugar and what you can do to lessen it, how you can, talk to yourself about this and what you're going through, what's happening in your brain, like why are you feeling bad? Because ultimately, when we do stuff that makes us feel bad, it's just a default that we think, oh, I shouldn't be doing this, right? If it hurts me, why would I do this? So a lot of times our innate part of our brain will then want us to crave sugar even more, because sugar is the thing that made us feel really good. But we have to understand from a neurobiological standpoint, we've been abusing our brains by constantly bombarding it with dopamine from sugar. And this is the way in which our brain is healing. And it manifests as headaches. It manifests as a little bit of brain fog. It manifests as some irritability, but it gets better. And once you get over that part, you start to see the positive effects in terms of how you feel, and it gets so much easier.
Yeah, it reminds me of the what you just said reminds me of the foreword that Dr. Amen wrote.
Yeah.
And in it he says, and I actually underlined this, the brain is beautiful and malleable, meaning that you can change your brain. How long does it take for the brain, like once we quit sugar and we, embark on or not quit sugar, cut down on sugar
Right.
and refine sugar, how long does it take for the brain to heal?
Well, it starts happening immediately. I think that's one of the things that people don't realize about the brain, is that it is almost like, if you could imagine if you were a bird flying over New York City, and it's never going to be static, right? You're never going to see every car stopped and every person stopped. There's always going to be movement. Things are changing. Things are moving in different directions. And that's how our brain is. It's constantly changing to adapt to our situation. And that's what's happening. The minute you stop consuming the added sugar or cut back or make that decision, even if it's just for one meal, if you go and let's just say you're going out for breakfast and normally you would get pancakes and syrup and, you would have a coffee with a ton of sugar in it. When you make that decision that, you know what, I'm going to have bacon and eggs and black coffee today, you're already starting the healing process. You've already started it. And it's something that I think, people need to realize. And I try to talk about this in the book a lot because I want people to see that these baby steps matter. Yes, you might not lose the 20 pounds that you want overnight by just changing that one meal, but you've started the process. You're putting yourself on that path. You're on that journey, and you just have to stick with it. And every day is going to get better. You're going to see positive effects. It's cumulative, though. I think that a lot of people are unaware that, it's a long-term effect that sugar has on our health. You don't die from eating cookies today, but you might die from a heart attack 20 years from now from your diet that you had when you were in your 20s and 30s, or at least it started in your 20s and 30s. And it's the same thing with wellness and getting better. You're on that journey. And if you want to ultimately get to that supreme level, it's going to take time, but you're making steps along the way and you're making progress along the way.
I love that. And it made me think of, and this is one of my favorite chapters, which is chapter 6 in your book, how to manage the 3 S's: stressors, setbacks, and social pressures. Can you touch on that?
Yeah, I think these are the big ones for a lot of people. I mean, stressor, I think, is, I don't even know where to begin with that. That could be a whole other book. But I think that the stress piece is really important to understand because, we are always facing stressors, and it's how we manage them that matters. And a lot of times people discover that they're managing their stress with sugar. And when you realize that, it becomes easier to cut back on it, because when you realize, like, okay, I'm stressed out at work, or I'm stressed when my kids come home from school and they got, 99 things going on and homework and they want a snack and I got to make dinner. When you realize that those stressors are what are leading you to then turn to sugar for some way to self-soothe, it can help you to rethink your situation and say, okay, well, how can I modify this situation so that I don't find this stressful, so that I don't feel like I'm compelled to go for the sugar in that particular situation. And so I talk a lot about triggers, whether or not they're people or situations. I also talk about trigger foods. One of the things that I think is a bit controversial about my take on this, and I'd love to hear what you think about this, Karen, is that, in the eating disorders community, there's this idea that, no food is a bad food, that you should be able to eat all foods in moderation. And so that's why I've had a lot of pushback from people who are in the eating disorders community about this concept of sugar addiction, because they think that you should be able to eat sugar in moderation. There's no such thing as a bad food. But my take on it is, if you're triggered by let's just say chocolate chip cookies, that they're not a food. You don't need to eat chocolate chip cookies to survive, right? I mean, we have plenty of other things we can eat. You don't have to eat cookies. So if that's the one thing that's going to set you off down a path of binging and guilt and distress, then that's your trigger food. So you just avoid it and you don't have it. And so I think that this idea of like everything in moderation, that sounds nice. But when we're talking about foods that are biologically designed in food labs to be addictive, to make it so that it's super hard to only have one, let alone a half of one, how can we expect people to just say, oh, okay, well, I'll have a little bit in moderation? So I don't advocate that people, completely cut everything out, right? I'm talking about lessening our dependence on sugar. But I think we all have, those couple of foods that are really the things that people cannot control. And I think if you need to completely abstain from them, then you should.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. I remember once going for ice cream with a friend of mine, and she looked at me and she was like, "You don't eat ice cream. You eat guilt and shame." And, it was like such a powerful thing for me because I was like, you're right. I'm not enjoying any part of
Right.
that. Right now, it's making me feel good for a little bit, but the amount of guilt and shame I'm going to eat because of like all these triggers that are associated with this food is just not worth it for me.
Yeah.
And I mean, this was like 15 years ago, and my relationship with food has shifted significantly since then because of the work that I've done. But the concept of moderation to me does not work, nor does the concept of complete abstinence from all sugar
Right.
foods either, right? But it's about that individualized approach and really understanding that certain foods have a real emotional, psychological tie for me. And
Mm-hmm.
probably cutting them out and choosing something else as a substitute is a better way for me to manage my own feelings, which ultimately is what causes this addictive chaos to me.
Exactly. And, I often say, and I talk about this in the book, if you're going to have sugar, you want to be intentional with it. Meaning you want to enjoy it. If you let's just say you go out for like a lovely evening with friends and you haven't had any chocolate cake in the longest time and you see it and it looks delicious and you want to have some, you want to be able to have it and enjoy it and
Yeah.
not have the guilt, not have the shame. And so you want to be able to do that. And so that's why I say if you do the work every day where you're working on reducing your sugar, you're not having 5 sugars in your coffee when you go to the coffee shop, you're cutting back on the added sugar in the processed food, you're not buying the processed food, you're maybe coming up with alternative snacks that you can have, you're making sure that you're intentional about looking at the food labels for condiments and things like that, making sure you're getting the ones that don't have any added sugar or making some of your own. I have a lot of recipes in my book Sugarless that are for condiments and other things. If you're putting in that work, then when it comes to the day where you're like, I really would love to have a piece of that chocolate cake, you could be intentional about it and have it and not have to feel guilty because you're having it as a sweet treat, as it was intended, not having sugar titrated throughout your day, which is what most of us have. And we don't even realize it because sugar is hidden in so many of the different products that are out there.
Oh, for sure. I love that. I honestly love that intentional approach to having it and appreciating it and being so conscious about it. It's that to me is just beautiful. So in the book, you also mentioned that 80% of products in supermarket contain added sugar.
Mm-hmm.
And also you just spoke about food being chemically engineered to be addictive.
Mm-hmm.
Can we talk about this toxic food environment we live in?
Yeah. I mean, it's getting out of control. And I don't know what else to say about it anymore other than, we have gotten to the point now where just because we can make these foods and create these like ridiculous concoctions in the laboratory, it doesn't mean we should.
Yeah.
And I really think that we need to have some regulation. And I'm not looking for a nanny state or anything like that where people are telling you can't have this, you can't have that. But I do think that we need to really pay attention to the fact that, some of these food companies are making products that have ingredients in them that are, so highly processed, lots of chemicals, lots of dyes, lots of additives that to me, they don't even constitute an actual food. I mean,
No.
you can't like make these things at home. You can't grow them in your garden. They are literal science experiments that are being packaged and sold to us to feed to our kids. And I really think that a lot of people are waking up and realizing that, it's gotten out of control, and we need to come up with a strategy to make sure it doesn't continue down the same path, because ultimately what's going to happen is people are going to continue to get sicker. We're seeing the rates of diabetes and, cholesterol levels going up amongst, 10-year-old kids. I mean, that's nuts. They shouldn't be having these adult problems when they're little kids. They're having them because of the processed food, because of all the added sugar, and because the way it's marketed toward them. So I think that you're right. It is a toxic food environment, but we really need to get together to figure out like how we're going to prevent this from continuing down the same toxic path.
For sure. And I was reading something the other day. Type 2 diabetes was originally referred to as adult onset
Yes.
diabetes, right? And now it's, you mentioned like kids
Yeah.
are being
They had
diagnosed.
we had to rename it type 2 diabetes because it wasn't just adult onset, it was kids getting it. Same with fatty liver disease. So fatty liver disease has been directly linked to sugar intake. And it used to be the case that the only people that got fatty liver disease were, alcoholics in their 50s. Now we're seeing little kids with fatty liver disease. And it's not because they're drinking alcohol, it's because they're eating too much sugar. And so we've had to create a new name for this condition, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. And so when we have to start renaming our health problems because they're perpetuating our youth, that signals that we're having some issues with keeping ourselves healthy. And, I think if anything, that should be the wake up call to people, because, we're just headed down the road of people who are, young people developing cardiovascular disease, diet related cardiovascular disease. It's just bound to continue to happen as we go down this path.
It's devastating. I mean, Rob Lustig refers to it as sugar is the alcohol of the child, right?
Yeah, I mean, from the fatty liver disease standpoint, yeah. And I also think, just thinking about how adults use alcohol, right? I mean, alcohol is used to, be a social lubricant. It's used to help you relax. It's used to make you feel better if you had a kind of a rough day. And I think when you look at our kids these days, they're using sugar in the same way. Hey, guess what? I'm having a birthday party. We're going to have soda. We're going to have cake. We're going to have cookies. We're having everything sugar. That's the social lubricant part. Right. So of course, then it's fun. The schools use it as a social lubricant to like make the kids, happy. They hand out candy at the parties and it's like all over the place. And then even for the emotional regulation standpoint, I mean, kids are using sugar to feel good. They're using it to self-soothe. And I think that we're sending the wrong message when we're allowing this to happen on the scale that it's happening.
Do you believe that sugar is a gateway drug for others, like alcohol and drugs later on in life, like when it starts with the kids?
Absolutely. I absolutely do. And we've seen this in research studies. We've done some preliminary early studies in rats who are, again, they're rats, but they're very tightly controlled conditions where we can show that you're more likely to consume alcohol, you're more likely to be sensitive to amphetamine. Other studies have shown links to cocaine use if you have a history of overeating sugar. So I do think it's a gateway drug. I think it's the most pervasive gateway drug that's out there. And I think that, when we take a look at, these patterns that emerge, we're going to see that, yes, sugar is linked to it. Just like prescription drug use is linked to heroin overdose or heroin use, right? That's like one of the greatest risk factors is misappropriate use of prescription painkillers for heroin overdose. I think that when we kind of titrate this back, we're going to see a lot of this started off with sugar too. Sugar is the primer. And it's, again, putting kids at risk. It doesn't mean that they're bound to become addicted to other drugs or to get into problems with other substances, but it's a risk factor. And we're basically, by letting our kids eat all this sugar all the time, we're allowing this risk factor to be there when we could avoid it.
Yeah. Oh, that frightens me. But I know in my own life, that's what happened, right? My addiction started with a sugar addiction when I was 4 years old. And I used sugar to soothe and to forget and to celebrate and to numb. And, later in life, I moved to other substances because that's the way that I learned to behave. Um, I want to touch on sweeteners briefly. I know we don't have that much time left. Sweeteners and sugar, the effect on the brain. What's the deal?
I feel like I'm like giving all the bad news. There's a lot of good news in this, but I feel like,
We'll get there.
because everyone's always hoping like, okay, well, when's she going to tell us like the good news? So the problem with the artificial sweeteners and these alternative sweeteners that are out there, I think there's a place for them. I think that if you're in the throes of addiction to sugar, they can actually help to be a crutch to help you get away from it, right? But I don't think that should be the end point, because what we know from the research is that the sweet taste is what drives the addiction. And so if you think you can just go and switch over to stevia or monk fruit or whatever you want to call whatever sweetener you're talking about, and you're going to solve your addiction to sugar, it's not going to work. It's like methadone for heroin. I mean, it's better than heroin, but it's really not ideal. And so what I think people need to really focus on is just reducing our dependence on sweetness. I mean, if you take a look, it's like over time, it's like slowly been creeping up that things have been getting sweeter and sweeter and sweeter. I often say, like, if somebody were to wake up who's been in a coma for 50 years and we gave them a bowl of cereal, they'd probably throw up because it's so sweet and so ridiculously sweet compared to what it was 50 years ago, because our tolerance keeps going up and up and up, and we keep sweetening these foods more and more and more. And we basically are training our palates such a way that, we need things to be overly sweet all the time. So the best thing you could do is try to reduce your dependence on the sweetness. And again, cutting back where you can is one of the best ways to do that. And it's not going to be one of these all or nothing approaches where it's like, I have to throw out all the sugar in my house and, I never could have it again. I don't think that mindset works. I think that this strategy of a harm reduction approach, of systematically figuring out where the sugar is, reducing it, getting it as low as you can, is the best strategy to help people navigate in our food environment.
Okay, so let's talk about some hopeful things, like the 7-step plan in your book. Can you give us an overview of that? And that change is possible.
Yeah, it absolutely is. So yeah, it's not all doom and gloom, I promise. No, there is a lot of positive that's come out of this. I think we've learned so much about not only the effects that sugar has on our brain, on the neuroscience, the physiology, but our relationship with food from like the psychology standpoint. I'm so interested in this because I think when we look at why we eat these certain foods and what they do to our mood, what they do to, our stress levels, that plays a big role in all of this. So in the book, I help people to get through this. I help people figure out, what is sugar addiction? What is the science behind it? What are the sugars? A lot of people don't realize there's over 280 different names for added sugar out there. So it's not like you can just, pick up a product and look at it and say, oh, it's got sugar in it. It's going to have a whole bunch of different names. And so I help people to realize, the different places where sugar is hiding so you can identify it. And then how you can systematically just chip away at changing your diet, changing your ways in which you approach things that are around food so that you could still enjoy them. You're not depriving yourself of anything, but you're going to do it in a sugar-less way. So if you're going out to dinner, you're still going to go out to dinner, but you're going to look at the menu ahead of time. And maybe you're going to ask for the sauce on the side or without sauce, or maybe you're going to have, one of the go-to meals that I recommend in the book for different types of cuisine at different types of restaurants that are, guaranteed to basically not have any sugar in them. You're just going to be prepared and have those extra tools. And that's what I provide in the book, is really this layer of added information and the skill set that people can use to then go about their day and make the changes and implement them in a way that's going to be sustainable, because that's key. Anybody could go on any diet and lose 20 pounds. I guarantee you, anyone could do it.
Yeah.
But they're going to gain 25 pounds after, right? They're going to gain it back because often they're not sustainable. So you want to do something that's sustainable for your health. And if you want to lose weight, that'll come. And it's got to be about our health and sustainable behaviors.
So I want to really focus on the key psychological strategies that you have for coping with sugar cravings and withdrawals. What
Yeah.
are they?
So again, I think distraction is a big one. I think when we are facing a sugar craving, a lot of times it's triggered by something in our environment, and so that can be an advertisement. It could be a trigger, a stressful trigger. And so putting the distance between yourself and the thing that is causing you to have that craving is critical. And so getting away from it physically, but also getting away from it time wise, because the longer you put time wise between having a craving and giving into the craving, the easier it's going to be to avoid those cravings in the future. They're going to get less and less and less attention. You have to remember, craving, it's a learning process. And so you are training yourself. If I have this craving and then I give into it, okay, I get it. I get the thing I want. It's like a little kid, right, who throws a temper tantrum, right? If you give the kid the toy because they threw the temper tantrum, you just want them to shut up, then guess what? They're going to throw another temper tantrum next time they
Yeah.
want something.
Yeah.
And your brain's doing the same thing. So when you can, resist and not give into the temper tantrum of a craving that your brain is throwing, then that means eventually your brain's going to stop throwing those temper tantrums and it's going to get easier, less intense. The cravings won't be as intense. So that's really critical for navigating through the cravings. Now, the withdrawal piece of it, a lot of it is physiological, but there is a psychological component too. And I really think that when we look at this through the lens of this is my brain healing and this is what needs to happen for it to heal, you can start to see, why that's happening and why, you're feeling this way. And knowing that it's temporary is important too, because it's not going to last forever. It's a short period of time in the grand scheme of things, but at the end, it's going to put you in a position where you're better off and you're feeling much better than you were before.
I love that. So just before we end, what research are you still wanting to do? What is still needed in order for us to make even more headway?
Yeah. So it's funny you ask that because I really didn't envision myself studying sugar addiction for the rest of my life. I kind of thought, all right, I'll go get my PhD in neuroscience and psychology and I'll figure out what I'm interested in. But this has become a life's passion for me and a life's work because there are so many questions that remain about this topic and what can we do to better understand it, how as our food environment changes. I just have more and more questions, right? So I think for me the next step is figuring out how can we make some changes in the way in which people approach nutrition and what they eat to help them use it as something that's a fuel for their body and move away from this pleasure component. I think that, we have a lot of work to do because we want to have pleasurable food, right? We want it to taste good, but I think that the pleasure has overtaken the power of food to nourish us. And so it used to be that, you got pleasure from eating fruits and berries, right? When you had them in season, when we were hunters and gatherers. But now the things that we're getting pleasure from are actually killing us. And so we have this biological drive to like things that are sweet because they used to be coded as safe, but that's no longer the case. So I'm really interested in thinking forward about how we're going to change that relationship with food, how we're going to kind of view this through this lens of now knowing that just because something's sweet doesn't mean it's good for you. And what does that mean in terms of our food environment?
Oh my gosh, I love that. This is homeostatic versus hedonic
Mm-hmm.
way of eating. And then I think what makes it way more complicated is that we are in a society where everything is about instant gratification
Oh, yeah.
and delaying pressure, delaying, any gratification. And not delaying gratification. And we have quick fixes for everything. The weight loss drugs, we don't really have to do the work, the fat burning machines,
Yeah.
we don't have to put in the effort. And maybe getting back to that point where we start appreciating how hard it is to actually earn our health, true health.
Yes. I love that. And I was having this conversation with my 8-year-old daughter about piano and how she takes piano lessons, but she's struggling because piano is hard.
So
And
hard.
her teacher is very intense and wants her to do well. And I had this conversation with her about, well, we're supposed to do hard things. Like if
Yeah.
you do something that's hard, you're going to be so rewarded at the end of it because only few people can succeed when something's hard. A lot of people choose the easy way out, which is to just don't take piano, don't learn how to play it.
Yeah.
But when you try something hard and then you're able to achieve it, you could be so proud of yourself and you've done this huge accomplishment. And I really think applying that mindset to, like
Yeah.
you said, putting in the work with your diet, your health, it's going to take time. Yeah, you're not going to be a piano prodigy overnight, right? Just like you're not going to be, extremely fit overnight or extremely healthy overnight. It takes work, but that's okay. It's supposed to be hard work, and that's good because we're going to feel all that much more encouragement and appreciation after the fact.
I love that. I honestly think that that is, for me, the approach that I'm taking to life in general right now. It's like
Yeah.
we grow because we learn to do hard things.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, we need to start talking about that more. Like you said about the quick fixes, easy way out. Like, no, that's so like 5 years ago. Now it's about doing the hard way.
Let's do it the hard way. For sure. I know we've got to end. What are your top 3 tips for sugar-free living to heal your brain?
Yeah. So, like I said, the biggest tip I think is it doesn't have to be this huge thing. It's a small step if it has to be. If it's a big step, that's great. But small changes have long-term, very big effects. So those small changes are great. That's number 1. Number 2 is you got to start somewhere. I don't care where you start, whether it's your beverages, whether it's your breakfast, you got to pick that one thing that you're focusing on. And you're going to do everything you can to figure out how you can make that food or that meal or whatever it might be as sugar-less as possible.
Yeah.
And then the third thing is I really think that we need to always come back to our health and our longevity. And that's what this is about. It's about living as long as you can, as healthy as you can, and, keeping that in mind. And that's a tough goal because it's way in the future, right? Most of us aren't there yet. We're thinking like, oh, I just want to, look good for this wedding I got to go to, or I got to, the summer's coming up. I'm going to be in a bathing suit. Oh my gosh. But I really think we need to keep that long game in play. Like you've got to be thinking about the future you because you're building the future you now. And when you get to the future, you can't go back and change your behavior. So you really got to put the work in now to make sure the future you is as healthy as it can be.
I love that. What a beautiful, powerful way to end. I'm going to link everything below your book, which is absolutely incredible. How else can we support you?
Yeah. So if you want to learn more about the work that we're doing, you can check out my website, drnicoleavena.com. And you can also follow me on social media. I'm on Instagram, Facebook at Dr. Nicole Avena.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Nicole. It was such a pleasure speaking with you. It was my favorite interview. I'm so grateful you're the first to be so we can bring the sugar-free show back. I'm just really grateful for everything that you do.
Oh, thank you so much. And thank you so much for having me. It's so great to talk to you.